story of Helen Keller? By show of hands. Okay, so we got a few who don't. So I'm going to go ahead and start off a little bit. I want to tell you a little bit about who Helen Keller was, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about who inspired Helen. Helen was a deafblind child. She lost her sight and her hearing through scarlet fever, which was very common in the 1800s. We had a lot of children who suffered disability as a result of this debilitating disease. Today we know penicillin, and we know very few people who have that. But back then it was a fatal disease, and for those who survived it, they often were left disabled. Helen lost her hearing and her sight at a very young age and became absolutely unmanageable at home. And her parents finally found somebody to come in and help her out. Helen became an icon in this country. There are books and lore written about who Helen was and what she did. She flew with the Wright brothers. She rode a bicycle with her teacher on the front end, and the bike on the back said "blind driver on board." People knew who Helen was. She lived a normal life, as much so as anybody could expect for someone who's deaf and blind in the early 1900s. But when I was a young girl, I remembered reading another story. And I'll be honest, I still can't find that book, but I finally found the character. A young lady named Laura Bridgman. Laura was born in 1829 to a farming family up in New Hampshire. She was a vibrant young 2-year-old with all the inquisitiveness of any 2-year-old you ever met. You can imagine, a 2-year-old running around on a farm. She's got older brothers and sisters. She's helping pick up the eggs and helping do the chores. She lived in that household and was a very vibrant part of it. And in 1832, scarlet fever struck the house. Her 2 older sisters were killed. And when Laura finally recovered after several weeks of illness, she lost her hearing, her sight, her sense of smell, and most of her sense of taste. She was left in the dark, an imprisoned guest in her own home. That's one person put it. The same year that Laura was born, a gentleman named Samuel Howe came up with an idea for a school for the blind. He lived in a time when social reform was a very big part of what was going on, and people wanted to find a way to help those who were disabled, who were not able to function in a normal realm. And his idea was to open a school for blind children and give them a place to come and learn, to go out and function in the real world eventually, but to initially begin by learning to function within their own kind, if you will. That was a lot of people will talk about the schools for the blind and the schools for the deaf. The children who were part of that were the beneficiaries and the victims of this practice, because they gained so many things, but they also became the victims of being trapped into that small world for the rest of their lives, because they could function very well within a classroom or within a school that was set up for them, but not as well outside. But Mr. Howe had this idea, and in 1832 he opened Perkins School for the Blind. And started teaching blind children. Well, 5 years into it, he was doing very well. The school was well renowned. There were other schools opening up around the country following his methods, but he was getting bored, to be honest with you. And he heard about a young lady up in Rhode Island who was absolutely unmanageable at this point. Laura was now 7 years old. She could sew. She was great at imitation, so if Mom was in the kitchen sweeping, Laura would imitate Mom. So she was great at helping out around the house with the chores, but when she got frustrated because she couldn't communicate, she would throw temper tantrums, and she was strong. Her father was the only one who could overpower her to get her back under control. Now I want you to imagine Laura's life at this point. You can't hear, you can't see, you can't smell, and you can taste very little. Somebody wants you to come. Close your eyes for just a moment. Imagine. Somebody wants you to come, they pulled you. Somebody wants you to go away, they pushed you. Somebody wanted to let you know you were doing okay, they patted you on top of your head. Somebody wanted to let you know that you weren't doing okay, they patted your back. This was her world. She didn't know anything else. She'd lost the memories of sight and sound that she had as a 2-year-old, so this is what she knew. Enter Mr. Howe. Her family was struggling and frustrated, so when he approached the farmhouse and said, "I'd like to take your daughter back to my school and see if I can help her," they said, "Great, take her, please, we can't deal with her anymore." And he took Laura back to the school, and he began to work with Laura. She was a beautiful child and became what today we would call a poster child for the school. People would come from all over the place to see Laura and to see this child functioning in the school. He used raised letters. He created initially, he would put a cup on the table and attach to the cup raised letters with the word cup on it until she got used to the feel of those letters and what it meant. And eventually, over a period of time, he'd start breaking those letters up and she'd have to spell out the words. And that was when he finally understood, she really understood the concept of language. Eventually, he developed something called finger spelling. For those of you who know the Helen Keller story, this will sound familiar to you. It was the Braille alphabet, but rather than being, she couldn't see it, so somebody would sit there and spell it into her hand. And she learned to finger spell. Once she learned to do this, a teacher sat with her at all times, and she began to learn. She took social studies, and mathematics, and science, and history, and she read constantly. She learned Braille. She was a bright young lady, and at the age of 20, she graduated. She's ready to go out into the real world, right? For the first time in her life, she didn't have a teacher sitting there finger spelling into her hand everything that was happening. They decided that the best place for her to be would be to go home. Interactions with family and friends, people who knew her. So Laura was shipped back to the farmhouse in New Hampshire. Her family was amazed at how well she was doing, but they didn't have time to sit there and spell everything for her, and talk to her. They were running a farm. They were trying to survive. Sorry, I just lost my math, 1849. They're trying to survive. They didn't have time for Laura. And so over a period of a very short time, her health began to deteriorate. She became depressed. She became lonesome. Now, Mr. Howe was keeping in touch with her, and he heard about this, and it really bothered him quite a bit. So he got in touch with a couple of the folks from the school, and they raised an endowment fund. And they brought Laura back to the school, where she became a teacher. She lived in one of the dormitories with the children. She took her turns at the school, helping out with chores. She taught needlepoint to the children. And the stories talk about the fact that she tormented generations of children with her needlepoint because she was a stickler. She could feel every missed stitch and would make them take it out and redo it until they got it right. She was incredible. She would sell her needlepoint so she had money to give gifts to people and to help out with charity. That was one of the things she enjoyed. In 1886, I'm sorry, going back further than that, in the 1860s, Dickens came over from England and actually visited the School for the Blind and met Laura and wrote about her. Charles Dickens wrote about Laura in one of his books called American Stories. In 1886, a family with another blind deaf girl named Helen read Charles Dickens' stories and realized that there might be hope for their child. So they called the School for the Blind. A young lady at that school who was a graduate of the program, most people don't know that Anne Sullivan was visually impaired herself. Anne Sullivan had been taught finger spelling by Laura Bridgman. And Anne Sullivan was sent out to the Keller household to try and reach this young lady. In 1889, Laura Bridgman died. Her story slipped into obscurity. Nobody remembered who Laura was. There was another bright, young, beautiful girl on scene who was doing so many things. And it wasn't until 1940, when another man picked up Charles Dickens' story and read it, that Laura's story was finally written down. So when you see somebody who overcomes something and you think, wow, they're so big, they're so great, they've done so many things, stop and remember, it was somebody else